Marhaba. I'm Christopher Hibma, and this is Maharat, Producing in Unproductive Times by Atijahat Independent Culture, a series created for artists in the Arab region that celebrates creative producers and the skills it takes to make things happen. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the fundamentals of financing your project with the American producer Mara Isaacs. Producing, in its core, is about designing a methodology for an idea to advance from concept to fully realized production. You may be reluctant to think about how much this will all cost. How can you create a budget that reflects the reality of every step from draft to production? How might your budget reflect what you can fundraise for? We'll be exploring answers to some of these questions in today's episode. A budget consists of two basic elements: expenses and projected income. We'll be talking about finding the funding in a later episode, so for now, let's focus on the fundamentals of budgeting. Each project is unique, but here is a basic breakdown of expense types. Personnel. These are the stipends or salaries you'll pay everyone to work on your project. Your director, actors, dramaturg, and designers are part of this. But remember to include your technicians, crew members, and stage management as well. Don't forget about your marketing team and translators or videographers if needed to. It is critical that you prioritize paying your collaborators and valuing their time, financially or otherwise. More on that in a bit. Venue. These are the costs for renting space, both for your rehearsals and for your performances. Production. This is the cost of buying or renting costumes, sets, props, as well as AV and lighting equipment. Travel. Travel includes transportation, accommodation, and visa expenses. And if you're hoping to tour your project or produce it internationally, this number will likely be a significant bulk of your total budget because air travel, visa applications, and hotel rooms are always expensive. Miscellaneous expenses. Items in this category include some of the things that producers quite often forget when they're designing budgets. Those expenses might be unforeseen legal fees or bank transfer fees. Miscellaneous expenses might also include small items like last-minute meals for your cast or printing new drafts of the script. Add those numbers up, and then finally, add 10% for contingency expenses. You'll need contingency because unplanned things always happen. Prices will go up at the last minute, or your team may need additional resources. You should always account for a contingency. Also, because no budget is perfect, you'll very likely to have forgotten something. And that is how you make a budget. Of course, in many countries in the Arab region, the value of local currency shifts and inflation rates are astronomically high. For that reason, I strongly advise that you make your budget in either US dollars or euros, especially if your project involves international components. I am an advocate for artists developing projects and collaborating across cultures. The budgets for such collaborations, including costs for touring, are complicated to say the least and are often segmented into different sections, each including individual stops or one portion of the tour. Tours, because of their duration as well as the cost of international travel, are also often quite expensive and typically include a number of partners and co-producers. The bottom line is probably overwhelming and much higher than you would initially thought it would be. This is where your savviness comes in and where you can start to make adjustments based on what you think you can feasibly fundraise. Maybe you realize you can afford to produce in a smaller theater or to do something site-specific. Maybe you can cut a production element or double cast a role. Producing is about making choices that allow you to make the best of your vision with your resources. And remember, exciting creative solutions can emerge out of tight budgets and limited resources. I've always said that creating a budget is a creative act. I also encourage you to use your network to leverage in-kind donations. These are goods and services that are offered for free or at a subsidized rate, which you would otherwise have had to pay for in cash. Maybe you know someone who has a printer you can use or willing to lend you a free rehearsal space, or to cater rehearsals for your team. Solicit and accept these contributions with a lot of gratitude and continue to track them on your budget for accounting purposes. Mara Isaacs is an American producer who has produced over 150 projects that have been seen in theaters around the world as well as on Broadway. Her journey has been remarkable, and it was a pleasure to chat with her recently about the fundamentals of budgeting. Does creating a budget for you come easily? Is it a heavy lift for you? What are some of the things that you do you have a philosophy about budgeting, first of all?
Yeah, so I do, because I actually find budgets to be a great way to kind of force you to think through what the needs of a project are. So to me, a budget is a really great planning tool to really make sure that you considered all the questions. There's two kind of fundamentally different ways to go about budgeting. One is, you know how much money you have to work with. And so your budget is about figuring out, how do I divvy up those monies in a way that makes sense? And the other method is to actually dream, what if I could do this the way I wanted to, what would it cost? And then how do I find the resources to support that thing? And reality usually, points you towards that first model, but I tend to start with the second model, which is I start within reason with okay, if I really want to do this show the way I want to do it, and I know I'm going to pay all of the performers X number of dollars a week or per performance, depending on how it's organized. And I have a budget template that has all the line items I could possibly think of. So I'm not reinventing, and I'm not worried about forgetting something, because it's a pretty exhaustive list, and most of the lines don't ever get filled in because they're not needed for every project.
Sure.
But I go through and I think, okay, what do I need on my production team? Who needs to be there? How much time do they need to spend? What are they getting paid? Who's on the creative team? Same questions. What am I doing with performers? What do I need in terms of physical production? Are we building things? Are we renting things? Are we buying things? Are we borrowing things? There's insurance, both in terms of, here in the US, liability insurance is very important because people love to sue each other. But also workers' compensation insurance. If somebody gets injured while they're working on a project, you want to make sure that you have proper coverage to take care of them. What else? Storage, freight, travel, per diem. You just kind of go through each line and really think through, what's it going to take to get this project off the ground? And maybe you have to think about it in phases. So maybe there's actually a budget. Sometimes I'll break the budget down and make multiple budgets for one project, so that I can see, well, this is what the workshop costs, and this is what this residency is going to cost. And, we're going to do a research phase, and then we're going to, have our first production. And then there's a cover page where all of those numbers kind of show up together. So you can see the big picture, but you can also look at it in smaller chunks. And also part and parcel with that is thinking about cash flow, because there's budgeting and then there's cash flow, which is to say that you're not necessarily going to get all of the money in to pay for the project before you start the project. So you also have to think about, when do I need to spend the money? So once you've kind of figured out the total costs, you also think about, well, am I going to, and you can do your cash flow by week, you could do it by month, you could do it by quarter, that's a personal choice depending on the particulars of your project. But it's really important not just to think about the totals, but to really be practical. Be like, okay, this grant isn't going to pay out for 3 months, but I've got to spend the money now. So how is that cash flow going to work? Am I taking out a loan that's going to get paid back when I get this money in? Am I, taking something out of my savings account, which I have done, until I know this money is going to come in? What are the different ways that we can make sure that people get paid? The other thing that I'll just add, which is maybe the hardest part about producing, and one of the reasons why, there are so many issues around people associating producers with people who have wealth.
Sure.
Because typically the producer gets paid last. after all the other expenses have been paid. And so if you're trying to be a producer and you have all the skill sets and all the vision, but you don't come from wealth, how do you support yourself while you're trying to get these projects off the ground? So I do think it's important and valuable for producers to make sure to take themselves into account as they're figuring out this cash flow. I should get a producing fee for this project. I'm going to pay myself as I'm paying the performers and the actors. And that hasn't been the tradition, but that doesn't mean it, you know, again, when you talk about what's equitable, we also have to think about how do we make it equitable for producers so we can attract more producers into the mix who reflect the world that we're actually in.
Catch my whole river conversation with Mara at the link below, where we talk about her producing career, the ins and outs of a production budget, and the importance of equity with your company. I hope you found this as inspiring as I did and are ready to make your next budget. Comment below and on our social media channels with any further questions or thoughts that you may have. In our next episode, we'll be joined by two friends of mine here in Minneapolis, the Guthrie Theater's artistic director, Joseph Hodge, and Philip Byler, the senior curator of Maharat's gracious hosting venue, the Walker Arts Center. Ma'a Salama.